Well, what I try and say is that everyone has to find this out for themselves, but whatever your political prejudice or allegiance may be, the critical thing is to be consistently anti-totalitarian. Now, that may sound very easy. Who's in favor of totalitarianism? No one says they are. But if you went to a meeting in favor of the African National Congress, for example, which I often did, I knew I was speaking on the same platform as several people who were members of the South African Communist Party, which was then the most pro-Moscow Communist Party in the world. I thought, okay, on this bit, I'm willing to fight alongside them and shoulder to shoulder with them, but we'll later have a big disagreement about Czechoslovakia. I'll make sure that we do. Partly to be true to myself, partly to test my arguments against theirs. Same with some of the people I identified with in Poland against the communist dictatorship. There, I knew that many of them were extreme right-wing. They wouldn't say it in public, but they were quite right-wing, often quite anti-Semitic nationalists. I say, well, okay, I'm with you about the Warsaw Pact, but we have a further fight coming. The whole joy of being a revolutionary is that the revolution is within the revolution. So the book, which, by the way, is available at fine bookstores everywhere, attempts to be true to that thought, that the struggle is never over, but that it's worth having for its own sake, win or lose. And, you asked me what the hardest one was.
Well, sometimes the price has been quite high, hasn't it? I mean, sometimes you've taken positions...
Well, the price is that you can yourself be accused of being a communist or a fascist, say, because of the company you keep. And this is a vulgar way of thinking, but people use it a lot, so that having been in favor of the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime for quite a long time, one can get accused of being, I don't know, Bush's poodle or some idiotic allegation like that. I guess since I've mentioned Iraq, I would say, and you asked me what was the hardest, that was the hardest. Something that seems self-evident to me, that Iraq should not be the private property of a psychopathic, aggressive, law-breaking crime family, wasn't as evident as I thought it was to everyone else. They all thought, no, this must be to do with some neocon Israeli lobby's sinister work. And I have a whole chapter about this, trying to set my part of the record straight, give some idea of what the regime change left actually did do and did think in Iraq and in Kurdistan as well as elsewhere, against the unbelievable tide of calumny and defamation that one had to endure for it. And there's a whole different risk being run, which is that you have to be boring about it. The one thing my mother told me I should never be. No, okay, I'll come back to this argument again and again. I'll be the last one standing. I'll dry you out. I'll bore you to tears. I know about this. I'm not going to have the historical record written by liars. And yeah, that was the toughest by far. But we won, and now Iraq is a free country. And everyone is terribly upset by it. Fantastically upset they don't forgive the liberation of Iraq.
No, but
their rightness matters so much to them.
But can the price ever be too high, even when you choose the right? Even when
you can't know that in advance. You can give a rough idea of what the price of having Iraq continually controlled by Saddam Hussein would have been. If you like, I'll give you an actual example that's partly mentioned in the book. During the period of the sanctions, the anti-war movement would come to me every week and say, "Don't you realize the sanctions are killing?" The figures varied, but it was up to 100,000 young people and old people in Iraq every year. I thought the figures were exaggerated, but not by much. I mean, they were doing that. So I'd say, right, I agree with you. This is a terrible suffering imposed on the Iraqi people by the United Nations mandated legal international sanctions, by the way, but still, all right, let's lift the sanctions. But the price of that must be removing the regime, mustn't it? Because why are people suffering so much? Because while the Iraqis are starving, Saddam has built one palace in every province of the country, just to name one thing, just in his own name. It's sanctions plus Saddam that do the damage. Remove the regime, we can lift the sanctions. They would all say, we're not against the death of 100,000 Iraqis a year that much. Removing the dictator, much too high a price. That's bad faith, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. That's bad faith. They didn't care as much as they said they did. Now we have removed the sanctions and the regime and presumably cut the civilian casualties at least significantly to that extent and for that reason. Any thanks for it? Not that I've heard lately.
Now, people may want to come back on the argument.
That's just an instance.
But I just,
Here, it's a question there not of what you think, but of how you think, and that's how I thought.
But this is a memoir, an autobiography. And it's about people. It's about you and your friends and your supporters and your enemies.
And our games.
And sometimes people let you down. I mean, on those occasions, and on Salman Rushdie too, there's that strong sense that sometimes even the people really close to you just don't get it. And
no.
There's a real, I mean, that's the personal side of these arguments that comes over.
Look, there's a friend of mine at this festival who can be mentioned, I think, in the same breath as Salman's. I have a whole chapter about Salman I hope you would like to read, but she's called Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and she was born in Somalia, and on her own guess, and I think it's accurate, is the only girl in her class who's still alive. And she's incredibly charming and amusing because she amazingly thinks she's lucky, as she is, to be the only one alive. And she has survived beating, genital mutilation, forced marriage, various kinds of exile and cruelty, and also seen the total destruction of her society by theocratic goons. And there are a lot of people who think they would have sympathized with her only if she'd stayed where she was. But now that she's left all that and said goodbye to religion, goodbye to tribalism, goodbye to theocracy, she's accused of being a friend of secular Enlightenment types, who don't sympathize enough with the well springs of religious belief. Well, honestly, what a waste of freedom for people to talk about her like that. Yeah. And it was the same with Salman. Here's a case, Valentine's Day 1989. The verminous theocratic leader of a foreign state that's ruined itself in war and fascism, with the war with Iraq, the demolition of its civil society, whose country's in hopeless trouble, who's trying to promote himself, thinks the best way to recover credibility is to offer money in his own name, in public, to suborn murder of a writer of fiction who lives in London and isn't an Iranian. I think that's a pretty frontal assault on everything that I love, starting with and ending with the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. A huge number of liberals and leftists say, no, the problem is not the fatwa, the problem is the novel. How does Mr. Rushdie expect to upset a great religion and get away with it? This is defeat in the mind. This is masochism of the most disgusting kind. You don't need, as Aneurin Bevan, that great Welshman, said, you don't need to muzzle a sheep. People will do all the work for you. They'll beckon on the tyranny. They'll welcome it. And the next thing you know, the worst kind of relativism has set in.
I agree.
Well, they never.
However, one or two people have fallen out along the way in this. Not everybody has. There's a particularly good back cover for this book, which has all the usual sort of praise by Joseph Heller, Richard Dawkins, Ian McEwan, and then says...
You think that's usual?
Oh, I think so.
I had to work bloody hard to get that.
And then has a quote from Gore Vidal. I have been asked whether I wish to nominate the successor and inheritor a Dauphin or Delfino. I have decided to name Christopher Hitchens. This, however, is firmly struck out, and thereby must hang a tale.
Yeah, well, about 12 years ago, I got a call from Gore, from Italy, saying, Christopher, do you know what the word Delfino means? And I said, actually, I don't. I didn't say, should I guess? I think I might have done. But he said, well, it's the Italian for Dauphin. And I've been brooding. And he went on to say that he, as in advancing years, wondered, never having had a son, whether he should be anointing a successor. And he said, I thought of naming you. And I said, well, that's very handsome of you. I think that the architecture of the novels of the history of the United States that he's raised is extremely impressive. And he's also written some very, very enviable essays indeed. I would instance, I don't know, the Holy Family, the first one to really take the axe to the root of the Kennedy myth, and everyone probably has their favorite. So I was very gratified. He then wrote it down and sent it me as a letter. I kept it, and then a few years later I asked if I could use it as a blurb for a book, and he said yes. I partly intended that, so I did. And then something happened that I also knew might happen, which was that if you know Gore, you know that he may seem very radical and even quite left-wing, and very liberal, but in fact he's very conservative, and he's a supporter of the extreme right isolationist tradition of the United States that goes back to Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement before the Second World War, opposed to the American rescue of Europe, and let's say, to put it delicately, non-philo-Semitic in its manner. Actually, distinctly non-philo-Semitic. And I knew that he had this tendency in him, and the conspiratorial view that goes with it. But after 9/11, he gave it full rein and essentially said, it's too early to say, he wrote these words, it's too soon to tell whether Mr. bin Laden has anything to do with the blowing up of the World Trade Center. He's by no means the proven perpetrator. But it wasn't for him too early to say that he thought the Bush administration had arranged the blowing up of the World Trade Center. So I thought, no, come on, that's that. This is not a difference of emphasis at all. That's a root and branch difference. And we had a big quarrel. And he began to take back what he'd said about me. And I thought, well, since he's known to like a good feud, he can have one, can't he? And so I both reprinted it and crossed it out. So he can suck on that.
We haven't talked very much about literature, and time is running on. I'm not sure we should... what about the King of China?
Oh, Christ.
We haven't done the King of China.
We haven't done...
It's very important.
We haven't done the limericks.
We haven't done the limericks. And
what would you like to do?
I think the King of China is the key to understanding...
You think the King of China? It's a little arcane.
It's a little arcane? Come on, they're great.
They must wonder what we're...
Yes, they don't understand. You explain all the rules.
Ladies and gentlemen, throughout the book, I give instances of word games and dirty rhymes that I think are justified, well, actually partly for their own sake, but also because the more you do them, the better you get at them. And they can help to sort of build muscle in the use of language. And Peter likes very much the King of China, but I don't know, I prefer the substitute. It's easier to do.
You're in charge.